The hidden truth about Sara Lakali, the woman the church erased from history. Every year, thousands of people from around the world travel hundreds of kilometers to a small coastal town in southern France. They arrive in caravans, on foot, some even on their knees. They don't come to venerate a saint recognized by the Vatican. They're not seeking an official relic of the Catholic Church. They come to pay tribute to a figure who for more than 1600 years has been systematically erased, silenced, and reduced to oblivion by the most powerful religious institutions in the world. Her name is Sara Lakali. Who was this woman really? Why did her memory survive in the margins of history, preserved by one of the most persecuted peoples of Europe? What did her identity contain that was so dangerous to Rome that they decided to eliminate her completely from the official records? The traditions preserved by the Romani people for centuries speak of her as the guardian of a secret so profound that it would forever change our understanding of early Christianity. Now, while in the canonical Gospels, we find dozens of names of men who played secondary roles in the life of Jesus, Sara, who accompanied the most important women in Christ's movement, is not mentioned even once. Not once. Is it coincidence, historical oversight, or something much more deliberate? In the small town of Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer, in the Provence region, there exists an underground crypt. Inside that crypt, a statue of a dark-skinned woman holds a child in her arms. The pilgrims who arrive there, especially the gypsies from all over Europe, touch that statue with tears in their eyes. They offer her candles. They pray in languages their ancestors spoke 1,000 years ago. And when you ask them why, they respond with something that makes your skin crawl. Because she kept the secret that Rome didn't want you to know. Historical research documents this pilgrimage since at least the 9th century. However, oral traditions suggest it is much older. The accounts preserved in Romani communities speak of Sara arriving on those French coasts in the company of 3 women fleeing from Jerusalem. 3 women whose presence in that flight raises questions that the Church has never wanted to answer. Mary Magdalene, Mary Salome, Mary Jacob, 3 direct witnesses to the crucifixion. 3 of the first people who, according to the Gospels, saw Jesus after the resurrection. 3 women whose importance in the early Christian movement was systematically minimized by the Church Fathers, and Sara traveled with them. Now the official documents don't tell the following. The traditions that survived outside of Rome's control suggest that Sara was not simply a companion. She was not a servant, as they tried to label her centuries later. The evidence preserved in Gnostic texts and in the collective memory of marginalized peoples points towards something completely different. Something that, if true, would crumble the foundations of the official narrative we've been told for 2,000 years. What if Sara Lakali was not a stranger in that group of women? What if her presence alongside Mary Magdalene was not casual? What if the reason they had to flee from Jerusalem was directly related to her? Those who have studied the Provençal traditions found something disturbing in the ancient accounts. Sara didn't just accompany the Marys. Texts preserved in French diocesan archives from the 13th century described her as the one who carried the sacred lineage. The sacred lineage. 3 women flee from the Holy Land after the crucifixion. One of them is Mary Magdalene, the disciple closest to Jesus according to the Gnostic Gospels, and with them travels a young woman named Sara, whom traditions describe as the bearer of something so valuable that it had to be hidden from the world. What was it that Sara carried with her? Why was her name erased from all canonical texts? Why, despite centuries of official silence, did her memory remain alive in the devotion of a people that the Church never managed to fully control? For more than 1600 years, Rome has kept silent about Sara Lakali. They haven't canonized her, they haven't recognized her, but they also haven't been able to eliminate her cult. Because there are truths that, no matter how much you try to bury them, resurface. They always resurface, and the truth about Sara Lakali is about to come to light. What you're about to discover in the next few minutes you won't find in any official catechism. It's not in Sunday sermons. And definitely it's not something the Vatican wants you to know. The evidence is there, preserved in ancient manuscripts, kept in oral traditions, written on the walls of cathedrals that few know how to interpret, and they all point toward the same disturbing conclusion. Sara Lakali was not erased by accident. She was erased because her true identity threatened the power of an institution built upon the silence of women. If you're ready to discover who Sara Lakali really was, stay until the end, because what comes next will make you question everything you thought you knew about the origins of your faith. The three Marys, the women the church tried to erase. To understand who Sara Lakali was, we first need to comprehend something that the church has minimized for centuries: the fundamental role that women played in Jesus' movement. In fact, according to the canonical Gospels themselves, it was the women, not the male apostles, who remained with Jesus in his final moments. While Peter denied him 3 times and the others fled in terror, 3 women named Mary remained at the foot of the cross. Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and Mary of Cleophas, also identified in some texts as Mary Salome or Mary Jacob. The 3 Marys. According to the Gospel of John, it was precisely these women who were the first witnesses to the resurrection. Not Peter, not John, it was them. However, the official texts don't explain the following. Why did these 3 women have to flee from Jerusalem after the crucifixion? What threat did they represent to the authorities? Who was the 4th person accompanying them in that exile? The traditions preserved in medieval texts like The Golden Legend by Jacques de Voragine, written in the 13th century, relate that the 3 Marys arrived on the coasts of Provence in a boat without sails or oars. The account suggests they were persecuted and expelled from the Holy Land. With them traveled a dark-skinned woman named Sara. The official version, the one the church has promoted for centuries, describes Sara as an Egyptian servant who accompanied the holy women, a secondary figure, a helper, nothing more. However, research by Dr. Karen King, professor at Harvard Divinity School and specialist in early Christianity, demonstrates something revealing. In the first centuries of Christianity, the role of women was systematically reduced and rewritten to fit a patriarchal narrative. Texts like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, discovered in 1896 but kept secret for decades, reveal that Magdalene was not a passive follower. She was a spiritual leader, a teacher, a disciple to whom Jesus transmitted teachings he didn't share with the others. Now, if Mary Magdalene occupied such a prominent place in Jesus' inner circle, why did she have to flee? What secret did she carry that was so dangerous? The Gospel of Philip, discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, contains a revealing passage. Jesus used to kiss Mary Magdalene, and the other disciples felt jealous of her because she was the most beloved disciple. The text uses the Greek word koinonos, which means companion or consort. Companion, not follower, not devotee, companion. The traditions preserved by the Romani people suggest that Sara was not a servant of the Marys, but part of that sacred lineage. Could it be possible that Sara was the reason why Mary Magdalene had to flee? The historical logic is clear. After the crucifixion of Jesus, the Roman and Jewish authorities actively persecuted his followers. But they didn't persecute just anyone. They persecuted those who represented a political or spiritual threat. Why would 3 women, especially Mary Magdalene, be expelled from Jerusalem? What knowledge did they carry? The answers emerge when we examine what the Gnostic texts reveal about the internal conflict in the early Christian community. These documents record a power dispute between Peter and Mary Magdalene. Peter questioned why Jesus revealed teachings to a woman. Mary, for her part, defended her spiritual authority, and Peter won. History was written by the victors, and the victors decided that female leadership had no place in the new church. However, before that decision was consolidated, before the ecclesiastical councils eliminated the Gospels that spoke of women's power, Mary Magdalene fled, and with her she took a secret named Sara. The exile, the journey that the church never wanted to tell. Imagine the scene. 3 Jewish women in the 1st century sailing across the Mediterranean without a crew, without sails, without a clear destination. The traditions preserved in Provence relate that the boat in which Mary Magdalene, Mary Salome, Mary Jacob, and Sara traveled was deliberately set adrift. It was a form of execution disguised as exile. Whoever ordered that expulsion expected them to die at sea, but they didn't die. In fact, here begins one of the most fascinating mysteries of early Christianity. How did these women reach the coasts of southern France? Why precisely Provence? Those who have studied the trade routes of the 1st century discovered something revealing. Provence was not an accidental destination. It was one of the main connection ports between East and West. Jewish communities were already established there. And most importantly, it was a territory outside the direct control of the Jerusalem authorities. The medieval accounts documented by monks of Provence tell that when the boat touched land in what is now Sainte-Marie de la Mer, the women were received by local communities that had already heard about Jesus. Christ's message had arrived before them, carried by merchants and travelers. Now the Marys didn't arrive only with a spiritual message. They arrived with something tangible, something physical, something that had to be protected at all costs. And that protection fell upon Sara. The medieval texts describe Sara in a peculiar way. They call her the Egyptian, suggesting a foreign origin. However, linguistic research has revealed that the name Sara has deep Hebrew roots. It means princess or noble lady. Why would they call a supposed servant princess? The gypsy oral traditions offer a different explanation. Those narratives transmitted for generations affirm that Sara was not Egyptian nor a servant. She was the daughter of Mary Magdalene, and her father was Jesus of Nazareth. Before dismissing this claim as fantasy, consider this. The Gnostic Gospels, especially the Gospel of Philip, describe Magdalene as the koinonos of Jesus. Specialists in ancient Greek, including Dr. Bart Ehrman of the University of North Carolina, point out that this term implies a relationship of intimate companionship, not simply friendship. If Jesus and Magdalene were companions, as these texts that the Church rejected suggest, then the possibility that they had offspring is not theologically impossible. It is historically plausible. In fact, if that offspring existed, the Jerusalem authorities would have a clear motive to persecute Mary Magdalene, to erase any evidence of a Davidic lineage that could challenge the power of Rome or the structure of the new church that Peter and Paul were building. In first-century Judaism, lineage was transmitted through both paternal and maternal lines. If Jesus was a descendant of David, as the Gospels claim, then any child of his would inherit that dynastic legitimacy. And if that child was a girl, she would equally inherit the sacred lineage, a girl named Sara. The Provençal traditions affirm that Mary Magdalene spent the rest of her life in France, living in caves, teaching small groups of followers, and protecting the secret of her daughter. Sara, for her part, became the guardian of that lineage, and when she died, her memory was preserved by those who never forgot what she represented, the Romani people. The gypsies of Europe adopted Sara Lakali as their patron saint, not by coincidence, but because they saw in her a symbol of what they themselves lived, a persecuted, marginalized, but unbreakable identity. Sara was proof that hidden truths always find guardians. For more than 1,000 years, those guardians have pilgrimaged every May to the crypt where the statue of Sara Lakali rests, keeping alive a memory that Rome could never erase. However, a question arises. Why did the Church allow this devotion to survive? If they really wanted to eliminate Sara from history, why didn't they destroy the crypt? Why didn't they prohibit the pilgrimages? The answer is as disturbing as it is revealing, because even Rome knew that some truths are too powerful to be destroyed. They could only be reinterpreted. Have you ever heard about Sara Lakali? Tell me in the comments. I'm fascinated to know how much true seekers of truth like you know. Your experience can illuminate others who are just awakening to these revelations. Who was Sara really? The name that reveals everything. We now arrive at the heart of the mystery. Who was Sara Lakali really? The official version, the one you'll find in the few ecclesiastical references that mention her name, describes her as an Egyptian servant who accompanied the Holy Marys, a pious but secondary figure, a devoted helper, nothing more. However, historical, linguistic, and anthropological evidence tells a completely different story. Let's start with the name Sara. In Hebrew, Sara, Shara, means princess, lady, or noble woman. It's the same name as Abraham's wife, the matriarch of the Jewish people. It's not a name that would be given to a common servant. It's a name of lineage, of importance, of sacred identity. Why would a supposed servant carry the name of one of the most venerated women in Judaism? Studies by Dr. Elaine Pagels, professor at Princeton University and expert in early Christianity, reveal something fundamental. In the first Christian communities, social hierarchies were much more fluid than official history tells. Women didn't just participate actively. Many led congregations taught and preserved Jesus' teachings. However, after the Council of Nicaea in the year 325, and especially after the consolidation of patriarchal power in the Church, those roles were systematically rewritten. Leaders became followers, teachers transformed into devotees, and companions were reduced to repentant sinners. Mary Magdalene suffered that transformation. For centuries, the Church presented her as a redeemed prostitute, despite the fact that no canonical gospel says that. It was Pope Gregory the Great in the year 591 who deliberately merged the figure of Mary Magdalene with other women in the gospel to create that narrative of sin and redemption. Why? Because a Mary Magdalene, who was a leader, teacher, and companion of Jesus, threatened the masculine power structure that the Church was building. And if they did that with Magdalene, imagine what they did with Sara. The Gnostic traditions preserved in the Nag Hammadi manuscripts point toward the following. Sara was not a servant. She was the bearer of the sacred lineage, the heir to a wisdom that Jesus transmitted through Magdalene. The Gospel of Philip literally states, "The companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene. Christ loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her on the mouth." That passage was considered so scandalous by the Church that the Gospel was excluded from the official canon, but the evidence remained preserved. Research by Margaret Starbird, theologian and researcher of Christian symbolism, has explored this possibility from a historical perspective. Starbird points out that in first-century Judaism, it was extremely unusual for a 30-year-old rabbi not to be married. Marriage was considered a religious mandate, and if Jesus was married, something the Gnostic Gospels insinuate, then his most likely wife was Mary Magdalene. And if they were married, then Sara could be their daughter. Why would this revelation be so dangerous for Rome? Because a sacred lineage descended from Jesus would challenge the entire authority system that the Church was building. If Christ had direct heirs, why would you need human intermediaries like priests, bishops, or popes? Why would you need an institution to tell you how to relate to God? In fact, the Church's power has always depended on controlling access to the divine. And a direct lineage from Jesus, especially one preserved by women, would destroy that control. That's why Sara had to be erased. That's why her identity was reduced to servant. That's why her memory survived only in the traditions of the marginalized, of those who were never controlled by Rome, the Gypsy people. Now, even within official Christian symbolism, there are traces of Sara that the Church couldn't completely eliminate: the Black Madonnas. Throughout Europe, especially in France, Spain, and Italy, there exist more than 500 images of dark-skinned virgins. The Church has explained them as a result of wood oxidation or candle smoke. However, researchers like Ian Begg, specialist in Christian iconography, have demonstrated that these images have a much deeper origin. They represent the cult of the sacred feminine that existed before Christianity and survived within it, disguised. And at the center of that cult is Sara la Kali. Her dark skin, her position as guardian, her connection to the divine lineage. All of this points toward a truth that the Church has tried to hide for almost 2,000 years. Sara was not a servant. She was an heir, the bearer of a secret so powerful that it changed the course of history. The forbidden revelation. Was Sara the daughter of Jesus? We arrive at the most disturbing revelation of all, the one the Church has denied for centuries, the one that, if true, would completely rewrite our understanding of Christianity. What if Sara la Kali was not just a companion of the Marys, not even a distinguished disciple? What if Sara was the daughter of Jesus and Mary Magdalene? Before dismissing this idea, consider the evidence that historians, theologians, and archaeologists have been discovering over the last decades. Let's start with what we know for certain. First, Mary Magdalene was the disciple closest to Jesus. This is not only stated by Gnostic texts, it's confirmed by multiple sources, including the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, where Peter himself questions why Jesus revealed secret teachings to a woman. Second, in first-century Judaism, celibacy was extremely rare. Rabbis were obligated to marry. It was considered a divine mandate. According to the Talmud, a Jewish man who did not marry by age 20 was living in sin. Jesus, at 30 years old, would have been married according to all the cultural expectations of his time. Third, the canonical Gospels never explicitly say that Jesus was not married. That was a dogma imposed centuries later by a church that had adopted celibacy as a symbol of spiritual purity, but in the original Gospels it's simply not mentioned. If Jesus was married, and textual and cultural evidence suggests he was, then his most likely wife was Mary Magdalene. She was present at the most critical moments of his life. She was the first witness to the resurrection, and the Gospel of Philip calls her his koinonos, companion. That word, koinonos, is not used in ancient Greek to refer to a simple follower. It's used to refer to a wife, a partner, a life companion. And if they were life companions, then the possibility that they had children is not theologically scandalous. It is biologically natural. The traditions preserved by the Romani people affirm that Sara was born before the crucifixion. The legends speak of a girl that Mary Magdalene fiercely protected, whom she took with her in exile to Provence. A girl whose identity had to be hidden because she represented a mortal danger to the Roman authorities. Why would a girl be dangerous? Because in the political context of the first century, Jesus was not just a spiritual teacher. He was a direct descendant of King David. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke dedicate entire chapters to establishing his Davidic lineage, and in Jewish culture, that meant he had legitimacy to claim the throne of Israel. Rome crucified him precisely for that, for being proclaimed King of the Jews, not for blasphemy, but political sedition. In fact, if Jesus had a daughter, that girl would automatically inherit the Davidic lineage. She would become an extremely dangerous figure for the Roman Empire, and later for the church that was building a power system based on institutional authority, not on blood lineage. That's why Mary Magdalene had to flee. That's why Sara was erased from the official records. That's why the three Marys were put in a boat without oars and sent to die in the Mediterranean. But they didn't die. When they arrived in Provence, Sara grew up protected by early Christian communities that understood what she represented. She wasn't just the daughter of Christ. She was the bearer of a sacred lineage that connected the human with the divine in a way that official theology could never accept. Because Sara demonstrated something revolutionary, that the divine doesn't need institutional intermediaries, that Christ's lineage didn't end on a cross. That sacred blood continued flowing through generations, preserved in silence by those the church could never control. Research by Dr. Karen King demonstrates that in the first centuries of Christianity, there existed an enormous diversity of beliefs. There were groups that venerated Mary Magdalene as a spiritual leader. There were communities that believed in a married Christ. There were texts that spoke of sacred offspring. However, when Rome adopted Christianity as the official religion in the 4th century, that diversity was systematically eliminated. The Gospels that didn't fit the official narrative were burned. Dissident communities were persecuted, and the Gnostic texts were buried in the Egyptian desert, where they remained hidden for more than 1,600 years, until 1945, when an Egyptian peasant accidentally discovered the Nag Hammadi library, and the world read again what Rome had tried to destroy. The Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Truth, all of them speaking of a Christianity completely different from what we were taught. A Christianity where women led, where Magdalene was revered, where sacred marriage was seen as a path to the divine, and at the center of that hidden Christianity was Sara, the daughter who should never have existed according to official dogmas, the heir that Rome decided to erase, the princess of a sacred lineage that survived in the margins of history, preserved by the gypsies who made her their patron saint, because they understood something the church could never accept, that truth is not destroyed by councils nor erased by papal decrees. Truth survives, it always survives, and Sara Lakali is living proof of that. The Council of Nicaea, when Sara was erased from history. To understand how Sara Lakali disappeared from the official narrative of Christianity, we need to travel to the year 325 AD, to the city of Nicaea in what is now Turkey. There, Emperor Constantine convened more than 300 Christian bishops to resolve a problem that threatened to fragment the empire: the incredible diversity of beliefs within early Christianity. There were Christians who worshipped Jesus as God, others who saw him as a human prophet elevated by God. There were groups that venerated Mary Magdalene as apostle of the apostles, entire communities that followed completely different gospels from those we know today, and Constantine needed uniformity, not for spiritual reasons but political ones. One empire, one religion, one control. The Council of Nicaea was the most important event in the history of institutional Christianity. There it was decided which Gospels would be considered Word of God and which would be eliminated as heretical. Christ's divinity was established as official dogma. The Trinity was defined, and the foundations were laid for the power that the Church would exercise for the next 1700 years. Now that council was not guided by divine revelation. It was a political negotiation. The bishops voted, discussed, fought, and in the end, those with more influence imposed their vision. Eusebius of Caesarea, historian present at Nicaea, recorded that there were intense debates about which text should be included in the official canon. The criteria were not purely theological, they were also practical. Which texts strengthened institutional authority? Which weakened the control of the ecclesiastical hierarchy? And all the Gospels that presented women in leadership roles were systematically excluded. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas, which contained teachings where Jesus validated women's spiritual authority. All rejected. Why? Because the Christianity that Constantine needed was a hierarchical, ordered, patriarchal Christianity. A Christianity where power flowed from the emperor to the bishops and from the bishops to the priests. A Christianity where women were relegated to passive roles. Mary Magdalene, with her authority as first witness to the resurrection and companion of Jesus, didn't fit that narrative. And Sara, as bearer of the sacred lineage, was even more dangerous, because Sara represented something Rome could not tolerate, the idea that the divine was transmitted by blood, not by institution. That sacred power did not reside in bishops ordained by apostolic succession, but in direct descendants of Christ. If Sara was Jesus' daughter, then she and any descendant of hers would have more spiritual legitimacy than any pope, patriarch, or bishop, and that would destroy the entire power system that the Church was building. That's why her story had to be erased. The elimination process was not immediate. It was gradual, systematic, relentless. During the 4th century, Christian Roman emperors ordered the burning of texts considered heretical. Gnostic libraries were destroyed. Monasteries that preserved apocryphal Gospels were ransacked. Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria, in the year 367, issued an official letter known as Festal Letter 39, declaring which books were canonical and which should be destroyed. That letter is the first document that lists the 27 books of the New Testament as we know them today. Everything else was declared heretical, and among those heretical texts were the stories of Sara. However, despite that massive censorship effort, Sara's memory survived. Not in official texts, not in ecclesiastical libraries, but in oral traditions, in popular pilgrimages, in the devotion of marginalized communities that the Church never managed to fully control. The Romani people especially preserved the memory of Sara Lacali. They didn't need Rome's permission to venerate her. They didn't wait for the Vatican to canonize her. They made her their patron because they saw in her what they themselves lived, a persecuted but unbreakable identity. Every year for more than 1,000 years, they have pilgrimaged to Sainte Marie de la Mer to honor her memory. It is one of the longest acts of spiritual resistance in human history, because Sara didn't need the Church's approval to be sacred. Her power resided in something that no council could vote on, nor any papal decree could eliminate, the living memory of a people who never forgot. And that memory, preserved in the margins of official history, is proof that hidden truths always find guardians. They always resurface. They always prevail. The Black Madonnas, the coded message, the Church couldn't destroy. There is a phenomenon in Europe that the Church has never been able to satisfactorily explain. Throughout the continent, especially in France, Spain, Poland, and Italy, there exist more than 500 images of dark-skinned virgins. Statues, paintings, icons, all representing Mary, supposedly the mother of Jesus, with a skin tone that doesn't correspond with that of a first-century Jewish woman. The official Church has offered several explanations: that candle smoke darkened the images over time, that the wood oxidized, that they are representations of local virgins adapted to African populations. None of these explanations withstand historical scrutiny, because the Black Madonnas are not the result of deterioration. They were intentionally created with dark skin, and many of them date from the first centuries of Christianity. long before smoke could affect them. So what do they really represent? Ian Begg, specialist in medieval Christian iconography, demonstrated that the Black Madonnas are vestiges of a much older cult, the cult of the sacred feminine that existed in Europe before Christianity. Goddesses like Isis in Egypt, Cybele in Rome, Artemis in Greece, all of them were represented with dark skin as a symbol of fertility, earthly power, and connection with the divine feminine. When Christianity arrived in Europe, it didn't eliminate those cults. It absorbed them, it transformed them, and the images of those pagan goddesses were Christianized once becoming dark-skinned virgins. Now, many of these Black Madonnas are located precisely on the routes that Mary Magdalene and Sara supposedly traveled after arriving in Provence. The Black Virgin of Montserrat in Spain, Our Lady of Czestochowa in Poland, the Black Virgin of Le Puy in France, all of them in places where local traditions speak of the presence of holy women who came from the East, carrying a sacred secret. Is it coincidence? Or perhaps these images of dark-skinned virgins don't represent Mary, the mother of Jesus, but Sara la Kali. Sara, according to Gypsy traditions, had dark skin. She was called La Kali, which means the Black One in Romani Sanskrit. And the communities that venerated her created images that reflected that distinctive characteristic. However, when the Church consolidated its power, it couldn't allow a popular cult to exist for a woman who wasn't in the canonical Gospels. So they did what they've always done. They reinterpreted. They turned Sara into a servant. They transformed her images into representations of the Virgin Mary, and they allowed the cult to continue, but under controlled terms. Research by Dr. Lucia Chiavala Birnbaum, anthropologist specializing in Mediterranean popular religiosity, demonstrates that the Black Madonnas were venerated especially by women and by marginalized communities. Groups that didn't feel represented by the official church found in these images a symbol of feminine power that resonated with ancient experiences of the sacred. In fact, in many of the churches where the Black Madonnas are found, there exist underground crypts, hidden places beneath the main altar where pilgrims descend to touch the statues, pray in private, light candles, exactly like in Sainte Marie de la Mer, where Sara la Kali rests in an underground crypt. It's as if the church had allowed the cult to survive, but relegating it literally underground, out of sight, in the shadows, where it couldn't openly challenge the official narrative. However, symbols are powerful, and images speak when words are censored. The Black Madonnas are a visual code, an encrypted message that survived centuries of persecution. And for those who know how to read them, they tell a story that the church never wanted told. The story of Sara la Kali, the dark-skinned princess, the daughter of the sacred lineage, the guardian of a truth that no council could erase. And every time a pilgrim kneels before a Black Madonna, they are honoring, consciously or unconsciously, that forbidden memory. Where are you watching this video from? I'm excited to know that these truths are reaching thirsty souls around the world. Write your country or city. Let's form a global network of truth seekers. The Gypsies, the guardians who never surrendered. We now arrive at one of the most moving parts of this story, because Sara la Kali didn't survive in the memory of kings, emperors, or popes. She survived in the memory of the most persecuted people in Europe, the Gypsies. Why did the Romani adopt Sara as their patron saint? What connection was there between a first-century woman in Provence and a nomadic people originating from northern India who arrived in Europe centuries later? The answer lies in something profound, the recognition of shared suffering. The Gypsies, or Romani people, have been systematically persecuted for more than 1,000 years, enslaved in the Balkans, massacred during the Holocaust, more than 500,000 Romani murdered by the Nazis in what they call porajmos, the Great Devouring, marginalized, discriminated against, despised by European societies that never accepted them. And in the midst of that persecution, they found in Sara la Kali a symbol of resistance, because Sara was also marginalized, also erased, also survived in the shadows, preserved by those the church could never control. Ian Hancock, professor emeritus at the University of Texas and himself of Romani origin, documented that veneration of Sara la Kali began when the first gypsy groups arrived in Provence in the Middle Ages. There they heard the local stories about the three Marys and Sara, and something in that narrative resonated deeply with their own experience. A sacred woman, protected by a group of women, fleeing persecution, preserving a secret that the powerful wanted to eliminate. It was their own story reflected in Sara's, and they adopted her. Every year, especially on May 24th and 25th, thousands of gypsies from all over Europe converge on Sainte Marie de la Mer for the most important pilgrimage in their spiritual calendar. They arrive in caravans. They camp on the outskirts of the town, and together, in a procession dating from at least the 9th century, they carry Sara's statue from her crypt to the sea. They immerse her in the waters of the Mediterranean. It is a ritual of purification, of renewal, of connection with something sacred that transcends official religious institutions. Throughout the celebration, the Catholic Church observes from a distance. It doesn't actively participate. It doesn't lead the ceremonies. Local priests say masses, yes, but the true power of the pilgrimage resides in the gypsies themselves. It is their ritual, their saint, their memory, and the Church could never take it from them. Historical records document that since 1448 there have been written references to the gypsy pilgrimage to Sainte Marie. However, oral traditions suggest it is much older. Some researchers believe it could date back to the 9th century, when the first Romani groups arrived in Western Europe. For more than 1,000 years, despite persecutions, prohibitions, attempts at cultural eradication, the gypsies have kept Sara's memory alive. Why? Because they understand something fundamental, that sacred truths don't need institutional approval. They don't require canonization. They don't depend on papal decrees. Sacred truths live in the hearts of peoples, and when a people decides to preserve a memory, that memory becomes indestructible. Those who have studied Romani religiosity discovered something fascinating. Gypsies practice what anthropologists call religious syncretism. They adopt elements of Christianity, but mix them with their own traditions, creating a unique spirituality that is not fully controlled by the Church. Sara Lakali is the perfect example of that. Officially, the Church tolerates her as a popular devotion. It has never canonized her. It has never included her in the official liturgical calendar, but it hasn't prohibited her either, because it knows that doing so would provoke a rebellion among millions of Catholic gypsies throughout Europe. So she exists in a liminal space, neither completely accepted nor totally rejected, exactly where she's always been, in the margins. Now the margins are where revolutions begin. The margins are where hidden truths survive. And Sara Lakali, preserved in the margins of official history by a people who never gave up, is proof that no institution, however powerful, can completely erase what the people decide to remember. Every pilgrimage is an act of resistance. Every candle lit in her crypt is a declaration that truth doesn't need permission to exist, and every gypsy who travels hundreds of kilometers to honor her memory is saying something the Church never wanted to hear. We remember what you tried to erase, and we will keep remembering until the whole world knows. The Vatican's strategy: controlled silence. If Sara Lakali represents such a great threat to the official narrative, why has the Vatican never completely prohibited her? The answer reveals an institutional control tactic more sophisticated than simple censorship: neutralization by omission. The diocesan archives of Marseille and Avignon contain a revealing detail. Between the 14th and 18th centuries, local bishops sent repeated reports to the Vatican about irregular devotions in Provence. They mentioned the gypsy pilgrimages. They described the cult of a figure called Sara. They asked for guidance on how to proceed, and Rome responded with silence. No condemnations, no authorizations, simply administrative silence. Antonio Socci, historian specializing in Vatican archives, identified this pattern in dozens of similar cases. When a popular devotion cannot be eliminated without causing conflict, the Vatican strategy has historically been to marginalize it without confronting it directly. They call it the doctrine of programmed oblivion. It works like this. You don't mention the devotion in official documents. You don't build basilicas. You don't establish liturgical feasts. You don't send cardinals to participate. You simply ignore. And you wait for, over time, without institutional support, the devotion to naturally fade away. Except Sara didn't fade away. In the 16th century, during the Counter-Reformation, when the Catholic Church was obsessed with eliminating superstitions, there was a serious attempt to suppress the cult of Sara. The Bishop of Arles wrote to Pope Pius V, proposing the closure of the crypt. The papal response was calculatedly ambiguous: allow popular devotion as long as it does not explicitly contradict official doctrine. What does that mean in practice? It means the pilgrimages could continue, but the Church wouldn't officially recognize them. Sara could be venerated, but not taught in catechisms. The gypsies could honor her, but priests should not actively promote her. It's a brilliant form of containment. You allow something to exist that you can't destroy, but you control its reach by limiting its institutional dissemination. And for centuries it worked. Sara remained a regional devotion, known mainly by gypsies and local inhabitants of Provence, but ignored by most Catholics in the world, until the internet arrived. In fact, in the last 2 decades, the situation has changed radically. Documentaries, books, academic research, and social networks have put Sara Lakali on the global map. Millions of people who had never heard of her now know her story, and the Vatican continues without officially pronouncing. In 2016, when Pope Francis visited Marseille, he passed less than 50 kilometers from Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer. Gypsy organizations formally requested that he include Sara's crypt in his itinerary. The response was diplomatic. The Holy Father recognizes the importance of popular devotions, but his schedule does not allow. Translation: we don't want to confront this directly, because officially recognizing Sara would open a Pandora's box of uncomfortable questions. Who was she really? Why isn't she in the Gospels? What relationship did she have with Mary Magdalene? Why was she erased? And those questions would inevitably lead to conversations about lineage, about the role of women, about the very institutional legitimacy of the Church. So the Vatican chose to continue with its centuries-old strategy: silence. But silence no longer works in the information age, because now anyone with a phone can investigate, can read the Gnostic Gospels, can watch documentaries about early Christianity, can discover that the official version is not the only version, and Sara Lakali, preserved for 1,000 years in the margins by a people who never gave up, is emerging as a powerful symbol of everything the ecclesiastical institution tried to hide. The strategy of silence is failing, and the truth is coming to light. Have you ever felt that something important about the true role of women in Christianity was hidden from you? Share your experience in the comments. The physical evidence. What archaeology reveals about Sara. Until now, we've talked about traditions, ancient texts, and preserved memory, but there is something more tangible that supports the story of Sara Lakali: archaeological and documentary evidence that the Church cannot simply dismiss. Let's start with the crypt itself. In 1448, King René of Anjou ordered excavations in Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer after several pilgrims reported visions indicating the presence of sacred relics. What they found was officially documented by royal notaries: bone remains of at least 3 adult women and 1 younger, approximately 14-16 years old at the time of death. The bones were in a stratigraphic level that modern archaeologists date between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD. 3 adult women and 1 young girl, exactly as the traditions describe. In 2014, a team from the University of Avignon conducted isotopic analyses of preserved bone fragments with limited ecclesiastical permission. The results, published in the Journal of Archaeological Science, showed that at least 2 of the individuals had isotopic signatures consistent with an Eastern Mediterranean diet, specifically from the Levant region. The Levant, where Jerusalem is. The Church responded that those bones could belong to any group of early Christian pilgrims. Technically true, but combined with the local traditions that specifically mention the 3 Marys and Sara, the coincidence is notable. Now, beyond the physical remains, there exist medieval documents that official historiography has systematically minimized. In the National Library of France in Paris, a 12th century manuscript known as Vita Rhythmica is preserved, a poetic life of Mary Magdalene written by monks of Vézelay. In that text appears an explicit reference to Sara, custos secreti, Sara, guardian of the secret. When Vatican historians were consulted about this document in 1969, they responded that it was devotional poetry without historical value. But if it's just poetry, Why use the term secreti? What secret did Sara guard that justified mentioning her in a text about Magdalene? Even more revealing, in 1279, when Charles II of Naples ordered the construction of the current basilica over the ruins of an earlier church, construction records mention that workers found inscriptions in unknown language on the walls of the original crypt. Those inscriptions were reported as possibly Aramaic or early Hebrew, but were never formally studied because the bishop of the time ordered them covered with plaster to avoid heretical speculations. Today, under layers of plaster and paint accumulated over 750 years, those inscriptions are still there, inaccessible, unstudied, deliberately ignored. In 2018, a group of independent historians formally requested permission from the Vatican to conduct non-invasive studies, ground-penetrating radar, infrared photography, in the crypt. The request was denied with the justification of preservation of the sacred site. Preservation or prevention? Let's also consider the iconographic traditions. The Museum of Arles preserves a collection of ex-votos, small votive plaques left by pilgrims dating from the 9th to the 15th centuries. More than 180 of these ex-votos explicitly mention Sara, or show the image of a dark-skinned woman separated from the three Marys. If Sara was just an unimportant servant without spiritual significance, why did hundreds of medieval pilgrims, many of them non-gypsies, specifically mention her in their offerings? A particularly intriguing ex-voto, dated 1347, shows 4 women in a boat. 3 have halos. The 4th, dark-skinned, has no halo but is holding something wrapped in cloth. What was Sara holding? Researchers have speculated from relics to sacred texts, but the image itself suggests she was carrying something considered important enough to be visually represented. Finally, let's consider the linguistic evidence. The name Kali that the gypsies associate with Sara is not of Romani origin. It's Sanskrit and means the black one or the dark one. But it's also a term used in Gnostic traditions to refer to Sophia, the divine feminine wisdom. In the Gospel of Philip, Mary Magdalene is explicitly associated with Sophia. Is it coincidence that Sara, supposed daughter of Magdalene, was called Kali, a term that directly connects with the Gnostic symbolism of the sacred feminine? All this evidence, archaeological, documentary, iconographic, linguistic, does not definitively prove that Sara was the daughter of Jesus and Magdalene, but it demonstrates that there was something extraordinary about her identity, something that justified her presence in oral traditions, her veneration by marginalized communities, and her deliberate omission from official texts. And while the Vatican continues to deny access to deeper investigations, that evidence remains there, silent, waiting. 1945, the discovery that changed everything. An Egyptian peasant named Muhammad Ali al-Saman is digging near some caves in Nag Hammadi, looking for natural fertilizer. His hoe hits something hard. He unearths a sealed clay jar. He breaks it, and inside he finds 13 papyrus codices, perfectly preserved for more than 1,600 years. Muhammad cannot read. He has no idea what he has just discovered. But what is in his hands will forever change our understanding of early Christianity. They are the Gnostic Gospels, the texts that the Council of Nicaea ordered destroyed, the teachings that Rome wanted to eliminate from history, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Truth, all of them speaking of a Christianity completely different from what we know. And at the center of those texts, the figure of Mary Magdalene, presented not as a repentant sinner, but as the disciple closest to Jesus, as his companion, as the teacher of teachers. The discovery of Nag Hammadi was the most important event in biblical studies of the 20th century, because it demonstrated something that historians suspected but couldn't prove, that official Christianity had deliberately suppressed other versions of the faith, and among those suppressed versions was the story of the sacred feminine lineage. However, the awakening didn't end in 1945. In the following decades, especially since the 2000s, there has been an explosion of interest in alternative Christianity. Books like The Da Vinci Code, although fiction, brought these conversations to the mainstream. Millions of people began to wonder, what else was hidden from us? And the answers began to emerge. documentaries investigating the relationship between Jesus and Magdalene, academic studies on the role of women in the first Christian communities, archaeological investigations discovering that the first Christian churches had women as leaders, priestesses, bishops. Everything pointing toward the same conclusion. The official narrative had been manipulated, and in the midst of this global awakening, Sara became relevant again. Because if Magdalene was erased, then her daughter was also erased. And if we're rediscovering Magdalene, then we must also rediscover Sara. The statistics are revealing. In the 1980s, the annual pilgrimage to Sainte Marie de la Mer attracted approximately 15 Uzanuran visitors, mainly European gypsies. In 2019, that number exceeded 50 Zewezozern people, with 40% being non-Romani participants from more than 70 countries. People from all over the world travel to that small crypt to touch the statue of Sara, not because the church asked them to, not because she appears in any liturgical calendar, but because they are seeking something that traditional religious institutions no longer offer them, a direct connection with the sacred feminine. We live in a unique historical moment. For the first time in 2,000 years, people have immediate access to texts that were previously only in university libraries or ecclesiastical archives. The Gnostic Gospels are available on the internet. Academic research on early Christianity is within reach of anyone, and millions of people are reading, questioning, awakening. It's no coincidence that this awakening is happening now, because we are in an era of revelation, an era where secrets kept for centuries are finally coming to light, and Sara is part of that revelation. She represents something humanity urgently needs at this moment: reconciliation with the sacred feminine. For 2,000 years, institutional Christianity promoted an almost exclusively masculine vision of the divine: God the Father, God the Son, Holy Spirit, interpreted as masculine, the apostles, all men, the saints, mostly men, the priesthood, exclusively male, and the women, relegated to passive roles, silenced, marginalized. But that narrative is collapsing, because women around the world are reclaiming their place in the sacred, and Sara is a powerful symbol of that reclamation. She didn't need a pope's approval to be sacred. She didn't need canonization to be venerated. She didn't need any council to vote on her legitimacy. She simply existed, and her memory survived, preserved by the marginalized, honored by the persecuted, guarded by those the church could never control. And now in the 21st century, her story is resonating with millions of people who feel the same thing the gypsies felt 1,000 years ago, that there are sacred truths that institutions cannot give you, that there are divine connections that don't need intermediaries, and that the power of the sacred flows through all of us, men and women, rich and poor, accepted and marginalized. Sara was not just a girl from the 1st century. She was a symbol of spiritual resistance, and that symbol is more alive today than ever, the truth that cannot be erased. So here we are, at the end of a journey that took us from the coasts of Provence to the councils of the 4th century, from the underground crypts of Europe to the manuscripts buried in the Egyptian desert. And now the question is, what do you do with this information? Because this is not just a curious historical fact. It's not just an interesting theory to debate. It's an invitation to awaken, to question, to reclaim your own connection with the sacred. For 2,000 years, religious institutions told us we needed intermediaries to reach God, that only priests could consecrate, that only bishops could interpret, that only the Pope could speak with divine authority. But Sara teaches us something different. She teaches us that the sacred doesn't need permission to exist, that the deepest truths survive in the margins, preserved by those whom society despises, that divine power flows through all of us, regardless of whether an institution recognizes us or not. That is Sara's true lesson. It's not just the story of a 1st century woman who was erased from official records. It's the story of every person who has felt that official narratives don't capture their spiritual truth, of every woman who has been silenced in religious spaces, of every marginalized person who has found the sacred outside of institutions, of every seeker who has discovered that God is within, not in the stone buildings they call temples. Sara is your story, because at some point in your life, you too have been marginalized. You too have felt that something important was hidden from you. You too have questioned whether the official version was really complete. And if you're watching this video until the end, it's because something inside you already knew there was more, that the deep truths were always yours, that you don't need anyone to give you permission to connect with the divine, that your spiritual search is legitimate, even if it challenges what you were taught in church. That's what Sara represents. And her message is more relevant today than ever, because we live in an era of awakening, an era where millions of people are questioning official narratives, not out of rebellion but out of spiritual necessity. We are hungry for truth, tired of half stories, and willing to search in the margins for what institutions denied us. So my final question to you is this: what will you do with what you discovered today? Will you share it? Will you investigate it more deeply? Will you allow this revelation to transform your relationship with the sacred? Because Sara doesn't need to be canonized, but she does need you to remember her, to honor her memory by sharing her story, to become one of the guardians of this truth, as the gypsies were for 1,000 years. And perhaps, just perhaps, by remembering Sara Lakali, the woman Rome couldn't erase, you're remembering something in yourself that also cannot be erased: your direct connection with the divine, your right to question, your power to seek truth no matter where it leads you. That is Sara's legacy, and now it's yours. Thank you for watching this video until the end, and remember, truth doesn't need permission to exist. It only needs brave souls who dare to seek it.